Hey everyone, it's Alistair. Recently I've been making more of an effort to meet new people. I may not be the most sociable person around, but there's one person in particular that I've been really getting along with well. We have exactly the same type of humour, and they're super easy to talk to. Honestly, I don't think there's any conversation topic that could throw things off. Oh, hey, they just sent a message. Well, I love video game music, but it's not something I know how to share with people. Whenever I've revealed to people that 90% of my go-to music playlist is full of video game soundtracks or covers of video game music, I'm naturally met with a lot of confusion. People tend to hear video game music and think that I just listen to the Mario theme on loop for hours on end, or just 8-bit sound fonts. It got to the point where I just avoided the question entirely. If someone asks what my music taste is, I'll usually give some excuse like, oh, I listen to quite a lot of different stuff. But the problem is, video game music is such an all-encompassing term. Too much counts as video game music. You've got the older retro-style tunes from Mario and Zelda that most people would just call 8-bit music, modern games with fully orchestrated soundtracks, and everything imaginable in between. Then when you compare games that include music from established artists in their soundtrack, like the annual FIFA game to Final Fantasy VII Remake's Hollow, which you could probably play to someone without context and they think it's like any other indie rock song, the lines blur even more. So, in the quest to justify my niche affection for video game music, it's time to identify what the heck you can even consider video game music, what makes it so special, and highlight some examples of the good, the bad, and the ugly. Because just like real music, there's plenty of bad to balance out the good. First things first, it's important to address the tech. If you've ever wondered why those 8-bit tunes from classic 80s games are so catchy, it comes down to 3 things: simplicity, repetition, and speed. The reason being that your typical NES game cartridge can only fit about a couple hundred kilobytes of memory, which is an absolutely tiny amount compared to modern games, looking at you, Call of Duty Warzone. And don't forget, game developers had to allocate space for, a game, so there wasn't much room for music left over. It was crucial that a game's soundtrack would not only appeal to a player, who could be listening to one of these tracks for hours, but also that all of the tracks could fit onto the cartridge. The fact that composers had so little space to work with on an NES cartridge meant that melodies couldn't be complex, and short music loops were a necessity. Most of the classic NES tunes that come to mind from series like Mario, Zelda, Mega Man, or Castlevania are only about 30 seconds long, or if they're any longer, they incorporate a lot of the same melodies. That's why it was so important to nail the composition of these songs. Mega Man is a great example of this. So many of its tracks are incredibly catchy, and it's easy to feel energized when listening to a stage theme. It plays a crucial role in motivating you, the player, to try a level again when you fall off a stupid vanishing platform. The other thing that's so impressive about video game music is just how quickly it developed. SNES cartridges featured games with sizes as large as around 4 to 6 megabytes, which naturally meant space for more complex music. Nowadays, 4 to 6 megs still wouldn't get you very far, but at the time, the leap from NES to SNES in terms of music quality was incredible, and many of the greatest video game soundtracks were released around this time, including Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, Donkey Kong Country 2, Earthbound, and Mega Man X. Small progressions in hardware were having a huge impact on the quality and creativity of video game music. And when you take things a step further to the PS1 era, when games were using CD technology and included things like digitized vocals, the difference is night and day. With that said, technical limitations aren't always a blessing. Plenty of games on the NES and SNES were known for their iconic soundtracks, and these were often songs that were created by a computer chip. But it wasn't long before composers started creating video game music by recording real instruments. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not here to argue that real instruments are bad, but lots of video game consoles simply couldn't replicate the fidelity of recorded instruments at this time. Advance Wars Days of Ruin is a great example of this that I always think back to. The soundtrack isn't bad at all as far as composition goes, but it's full of heavy guitar riffs and tones that its platform of the Nintendo DS just couldn't really reproduce without sounding muddied. By far the most egregious example of this I can think of is good old Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. It was released in the early 2000s for the PlayStation 2, which had pretty advanced audio hardware at the time, but it also released on several other consoles, including the Nintendo 64. Now, you might be thinking, hey, the N64 was a great console, I see nothing wrong with this. Well, you'd be wrong. The PlayStation 2 used a disk drive, which meant that PS2 games could house several hundred meg of memory for whatever the developers wanted. But an N64 cartridge would still only max out at around 64 meg. See where I'm going with this? For the developers to port this game from the PS2 to the N64, sacrifices had to be made. Graphics were made worse, entire levels were cut out, and naturally the music was compressed. Honestly, the resulting music tracks are just awful, and some of them don't even match the original songs anymore. The tracks on the N64 don't hold a candle to the quality of the songs on the more advanced consoles, let alone the original studio-recorded iterations of each song. Nobody's ever going to go to a concert for one of these musicians or bands and say, "Yeah, this is great, but I think I prefer the version from Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 on the N64. Thankfully, this period was short-lived. Nowadays, it's the norm to record music for video games separately, and any games that feature licensed music will often sound the same as on any streaming service, and both the quality and scope of video game music continues to impress. But the other challenge with video game music is that the popularity of a game's soundtrack is almost synonymous with the popularity of the game it's from. There are plenty of people who will leap to the defense of the soundtrack for The Elder Scrolls or The Legend of Zelda, but funnily enough, you won't find quite as many fans of Echo the Dolphin. A good game with a mediocre soundtrack will likely still be remembered, but a game that nobody played with the best soundtrack of all time is still a game that nobody played. So, what ultimately counts as video game music, and what makes it so special? Well, I think these questions almost go hand in hand. The soundtracks for Doom and Animal Crossing would both count as video game music, but obviously these soundtracks are completely different in terms of genre and style. But what they both have in common is that they're a perfect match for the game they're from, and I think that's what I find so unique about video game music compared to other mediums. There's this whole other level of immersion you get when you're playing a video game compared to when you're just listening to an album or watching a film. When you're the one controlling a video game character, there's something almost personal about the soundtrack that accompanies, whether you're running around as the Doomslayer fighting off demons, or exploring the vast world of Hyrule on a grand adventure. There's something energizing about listening to a soundtrack that complements the gameplay so perfectly. RPGs is where I think this hits its pinnacle, and Final Fantasy VII's remake theme of Hollow is a good example. I'll avoid major spoilers, but here's a brief overview for those unfamiliar with the game or its theme. You play as Cloud, the blonde, cold, standoffish mercenary, who doesn't really open up to anyone except cheerful flower girl Aerith, until she gets kidnapped for story reasons, and it falls to Cloud to rescue her. The lyrics to Hollow are written from Cloud's perspective, putting into words his state of mind and his desire to rescue Aerith, which is made so much more impactful by the game. You've got the obvious narrative significance, especially for those who know the events of the original Final Fantasy VII, but there's also the more subconscious connection that a player would make through its gameplay. When Hollow begins to play near the end of the game, you've already experienced so many moments of gameplay featuring Cloud and Aerith fighting side by side. It makes it that much easier for the player to empathize with Cloud and understand the full weight behind those lyrics. I think this is what makes video game music so powerful. In the same way someone might listen to an album to relive the experience of going to a concert and hearing a song live, listening to video game music can evoke the memory of experiencing the gameplay and story of a video game for the first time. It goes beyond simply being just a pleasant sounding piece of music, and this constant recognition of the relationship between a video game and its soundtrack results in more diverse music when it comes to both style and composition. That's what I think anyway. So to wrap up, I want to highlight some of my personal favourite experiences I've had with video game music, and of course subject myself to some of the worst music video games have to offer. First up, Persona 5. Honestly, I'd be remiss to talk about video game music and not give special mention to Persona 5. This game oozes style in every aspect, and the soundtrack is no exception. Unfortunately, it's difficult to talk about many of my favourite songs from that game without avoiding spoilers, and Persona 5 is a game that I think everyone should experience for themselves. The songs that I want to give credit to for perfectly complementing both the gameplay and narrative are The Days When My Mother Was There, which plays during the game's 4th dungeon, as well as Keep Your Faith and Throw Away Your Mask, which are 2 arrangements of the song that plays during Persona 5 Royal's final boss. Instead, I'll cover one of the game's more well-known songs, Beneath the Mask. Beneath the Mask plays during the overworld sections of Persona 5's gameplay loop, during which you walk around Tokyo as a seemingly ordinary high school student, in contrast to the game's metaverse section, during which you explore cognitive palaces as a masked trickster. To anyone unfamiliar with the game, that probably sounded like complete nonsense, but hey, that's a Persona game in a nutshell. One look at the lyrics should make the allusions to the main character pretty obvious, which makes it easy for the player to align themselves with that main character's perspective. But what makes this song so special is just how comfortable it is. Beneath the Mask plays during the moments in Persona 5 when you're exploring Tokyo, hanging out with friends, or just relaxing and enjoying the scenery, and it complements those moments perfectly. The instrumental version of the song plays at the start of the game, but as you progress through the story, the vocals kick in and elevate the song even further. I also found something particularly nostalgic about this song when I played through Persona 5 Royal recently, and whenever I'm looking to just ease into the evening and relax, this is one of the first songs I'll fire up. If you've ever heard of Nier Automata before, you'll probably know about it because of either the story or the soundtrack. The soundtrack of Nier Automata features vocals from 3 talented vocalists, Emmy Evans, Janique Nicole, and Nami Nakagawa. Vocals in video game music are pretty common, but what the Nier series does differently is its language. Rather than sing in English or Japanese, the vocalists of Nier sing in Chaos language, an original language that was created as an interpretation of what our own modern languages could become thousands of years in the future. The phonetics of Chaos language are inspired by numerous different languages, including French, German, Japanese, and more. And this gives the Nier soundtrack an uncanny sense of familiarity, while still maintaining this unusual charm. It's one of the most hauntingly beautiful soundtracks ever, and it perfectly complements each of the game's settings and locations. Honestly, I could talk at length about many of the songs in Nier, but one of my personal favourites is the track that plays in the city ruins, one of the game's first major locations. Nier Automata is a game with multiple endings, which means that in a single playthrough you'll constantly be revisiting some of the main locations, often with different characters. The song starts off with fleeting, ethereal sounds, but every visit to the deserted city introduces something new to the song. Sometimes it'll add strings, then maybe vocals, developing the song further and further as the story progresses. It's such a visceral form of storytelling and makes the music so brilliant. This progression continues until a pivotal moment in the game's story. Again, I'll avoid spoilers, but as is typical of the Nier series, the event is pretty emotional and tragic. And in the aftermath of that pivotal story moment, when you return to the deserted city where the game began, the music evolves again. The new version of the track sounds almost cheerful in comparison, but this doesn't lead to a strange mismatch in consideration of the dramatic events of the game's story that just took place, but rather, it almost seems like the song is there to be uplifting, to urge the player to see things through to the end. It sets the perfect tone for the following segment of the game. Some of the other exceptional tracks from Nier Automata include A Beautiful Song, Song of the Ancients, Grandma, and Bipolar Nightmare, but honestly, the entirety of the soundtrack is worthy of the same praise. If I had to pick a single soundtrack to represent the unique impact that video game music can have, the Nier series would certainly be near the top of the list, if not number 1. Last but not least, I have to talk about that song. Megalovania, widely considered by many to be one of the greatest video game compositions of all time. Was it composed by one of the legends of video game composition like Koji Kondo or Nobuo Uematsu? Nope. It was created by one guy in his bedroom. That's not to sell short the accomplishments of Toby Fox, the creator of Undertale and composer of its soundtrack. In fact, quite the opposite. By 2015, video game music had moved on from its growing pains. Games like Super Mario Galaxy, its sequel Super Mario Galaxy 2, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, and even Mario Kart 8 were creating superb soundtracks with real-life performances, featuring orchestras or jazz bands, you name it. Nobody would have expected video game music to be revolutionized by an indie game developed by a single man with chiptune music that evoked the same style and tone of the NES and SNES eras. I think part of this is because of Undertale as a game and a genre. RPGs had been inundated with the same progression systems for decades by this point. Kill monsters to gain experience, grow stronger, and fight stronger monsters. Undertale discarded this trend, and instead presented the player with the question of whether they wanted to fight or spare the various creatures they encountered. This is a novel concept when you're just throwing down with a funny looking frog, but what about when it's a motherly companion who's been guiding you through an unfamiliar world? Or a witty skeleton that makes puns so bad you can't help but smile? Undertale, like the others on this list of exceptional games, mastered the synergy of gameplay and music. The game's first major boss theme, Heartache, is true to its name. It plays during a battle that the player doesn't want to win. They don't want to kill the opponent in front of them, but the irony of this is that if they play through the game like any other RPG, that's the only thing they'll know how to do. The song imitates this desperate plea to the player to recognize the tools they have available to them and find another solution, which makes the decision to spare the game's opponent all the more satisfying. But back to Megalovania. Megalovania plays in the battle against Sans. For anyone unfamiliar with the game, Sans the Skeleton is present throughout, offering comic relief, chatting away with other characters in the game, and just making everything a little bit more jolly. But to fight against Sans the Skeleton, you have to kill every creature you encounter, and I mean all of them. No one can be spared. Only after you've killed every creature that appears in the game's random encounters, as well as several major characters, will you reach the climax of the game's infamous genocide ending. This is what makes Megalovania so good. Remember what I said at the start of the video about why NES tunes were so catchy? Simplicity, repetition, and speed. Megalovania ticks all three of these boxes, but it takes things one step further by adding progression. Each new section of the song feels familiar, but changes just enough to keep the listener's interest. And as for gameplay, Megalovania evokes the same feeling that the Mega Man games captured so well. It shares that energetic, motivating feeling that drives the player into trying again and again, despite the difficulty of this particular gameplay sequence that is the battle with Sans. But what makes this so effective is when you consider the context behind the battle. At this point, your character has killed every other being in this world. You're not pushing through this difficult challenge to save the world from destructive robot masters, or rescue a princess from an evil Dark Lord. You're a murderous villain, and Megalovania is your theme, the music track driving you to secure your final kill. Undertale celebrated its 5th anniversary recently with an orchestral concert, and this is actually less unusual than it might sound at first, though it's rare for these events to ever leave Japan. But in the case of Undertale, I think it's a testament to how brilliant the original chiptune compositions are when you listen to them reimagined by a full-blown orchestra. Anyway, at the risk of this video becoming way too long, I'll wrap up on the good soundtracks with some honourable mentions. Octopath Traveler, Chrono Trigger, Bastion, Shadow of the Colossus, Cuphead, the Ori series, and the Castlevania series are all worth checking out as far as video game music goes. But now it's time for something that I'm not sure you could even call music. Okay, I get that this is supposed to be a horror game, but the only thing scary about this is the fact that it made it into the finished game. At first I thought there must have been some kind of mix-up here, because I couldn't imagine that someone at Capcom listened to this track and thought, oh yeah, this is perfect. But no, the absolute worst thing about this track is that this featured in Resident Evil 1 Director's Cut DualShock version, an awful bloated name for a re-release of the original Resident Evil 1. The game came out 2 years after the original with an updated soundtrack, so what does the original sound like, I hear you ask? You know, remastering games is all the rage right now, but props to Capcom for releasing a demaster in the late 90s. It's one thing to add an awful music track to your game, but to replace an already pretty good track with whatever on earth that was? There's actually quite an interesting scandal behind this track. A Japanese composer who pretended to be deaf, a ghostwriter who was writing all of his music for him. It's got all the makings of a Hollywood film, but if I have to listen to that track one more time, I'm going to need a lobotomy. So let's move on. The next tracks can't be any worse, right? I really shouldn't have said anything. You remember when you had music classes at school when you were a kid, and it was basically just an excuse to bash a load of different instruments for a bit? Well, Sega sure does, and they've got you covered. Either that, or a cat just walked over a keyboard for a bit, the composer left the recording running, and when it came to shipping the game, they said, nah, that'll do. Ironically, this game was perfectly set up to fade into obscurity. There weren't too many people clamoring for a Sonic RPG on the Nintendo DS. Heck, I love RPGs, and not even I wanted this. But the game came out, nobody cared, and nowadays the only thing it's really known for is, well, this. It's a shame, because the Sonic the Hedgehog series has had some pretty iconic songs in its history. But whatever this is kind of sums up the state the series was in around the late 2000s, and arguably is still in today. Not a good one. Alright, it's time for a palate cleanser for the ears. Nintendo was making great music around this time. A Zelda game for the Nintendo Wii has to have some incredible stuff, right? Now, I love Twilight Princess, and I get that they were going for an almost alien-like theme for the Twilight monsters, but who thought this was okay? Listening to this with headphones on is even worse. It feels like someone's tickling my ears, and not in a good way. So, that's an insight into the world of video game music. No doubt there's a lot of incredible music out there, as well as music tracks we'll never speak of again. But what I think makes this medium so compelling is the way it evokes an experience or memory with such immersion. And hey, now that I've figured out what I find so appealing about video game music, I don't feel the need to be cryptic about my music taste. In fact, I just messaged my new friend, and it turns out they also like video game music. They just sent me a link to their favourite song. What the heck is Crazy Bus?